Welcome to GovExperts Insights, where we talk about politics, policy, and the practice of both. I'm your host, Chris Britton. Today, we're exploring one of the most contested issues in American life, free speech. From college campuses to campaign finance, from hate speech debates to nonprofit advocacy, questions about speech and its limits are shaping law, politics, and civic life in profound ways. Our guest today is Luke Wachob, Senior Director of Communications and Policy at the People United for Privacy Foundation, who joined the foundation in October 2022 after nearly a decade as Communications Director for the Institute for Free Speech. He's a nationally recognized voice on donor privacy and nonprofit advocacy, with a strong record of helping organizations defend their First Amendment rights. Originally from Buffalo, New York, Luke studied public policy and administration at James Madison University and now resides in Washington, D.C. Luke, welcome back to GovExperts Insights as our first repeat guest. Thanks for joining our discussion about free speech.
Well, thank you for having me, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here.
Luke, I want to start with what's been dominating the headlines, the fallout after the Charlie Kirk assassination. That event sparked renewed debate about the threats to free speech, particularly when political violence or intimidation enter the picture. From your vantage point, how do you frame that challenge right now?
It's an enormous challenge, and I think the place to start is that the assassination of Charlie Kirk was an attack on free speech itself. Charlie was one of our great practitioners of free speech rights, and he encouraged young people to participate in peaceful debate, which I think our young people aren't always pushed enough to do. And he was killed, the evidence seems to suggest, certainly for his views and for espousing his views. So this was an attack on free speech, and in a broader sense, it was an effort to silence not just Charlie Kirk, but all the people who agree with Charlie or want to hear from him. Free speech is not just about our right to speak, it's also about our right to hear from other people and access the opinions and information that we want to. So in my opinion, the assassination of Charlie Kirk ought to be an occasion for all of us to recommit to free speech, civil debate, an open dialogue, and tolerance for differing points of views. And we are seeing a lot of that. People are having these conversations right now. Newspapers are flooded with guest opinions and letters to the editor about the importance of free speech from people who are scared, but also motivated and refusing to be silenced. Turning Point USA, the organization that Kirk led, is getting a flood of donations. They're opening a lot of new chapters. And that's all great. Those are all healthy responses to this event. There's also a policy discussion to be had here, and that's where my organization, the People United for Privacy Foundation, is attempting to make an impact and talk about how can we make it safer for Americans who participate in civic life, such as the members and donors of Charlie's organization, Turning Point, them from political violence, and make sure their free speech is protected. And we can talk more about that in this discussion as we move along. We're also in the aftermath of this event, not surprisingly, seeing a number of unhealthy reactions, some of that familiar cancel culture type stuff, trying to get people fired for an inappropriate comment they may have made about Kirk in the aftermath. More seriously, we're seeing government jawboning where, the FCC, for instance, pressuring companies, particularly media companies, to punish or promote certain speech. We've had officials making sort of daft comments about hate speech and using the assassination as a pretense to target liberal donors and nonprofits. And so these sorts of things all range from distractions to escalations that could even further harm free speech. So, these are potentially really dangerous roads to go down. And I think it would be just a shameful response to the legacy that Charlie left on free speech for that to be where we go. I think it's very important at this moment for us to choose the path of free speech and open debate and not choose the path of meeting violence with more violence and intolerance.
And you bring up a very good point in regards to free speech, and that is it's across the political spectrum of things important for both the right and the left of things. And I know you guys are focused on it's broader than just bipartisan, but you're focused on bipartisan protections regardless of kind of source of things, correct?
Yeah, we do a ton of work on both sides of the aisle. A lot of the work in the states that we do to try to get policies passed to make it harder to target people for their beliefs, to make it easier to support a cause. We've gotten Democrats and Republicans on board with that, nonprofits on the left and the right. This tends to be one of the few issues that you can get like a pro-life and a pro-choice group together on. They're both going to agree that their members, their donors should be able to support them without being put at risk of some extremist on the other side having access to your donation history along with your home address, sometimes your occupation and employer. I mean, this in today's increasingly connected world, and where it only takes one person to decide to respond to this activity by bringing a problem to your doorstep. People understand if you're engaged in civic life in any way, you want to be protected. And so this is, often the case with free speech. You have to defend your rights to be able to depend on your rights when other people are in power.
How do you see that, on free speech in general and, obviously the folks that want to protect it, but then those that are kind of questioning it, how do you organize them? How do you see them? Is it just somebody that's talking off the top of their head in the heat of the moment, which I think there could be some of that? Is it an organized effort? Is there things, because obviously free speech being so fundamental to American democracy, and as you pointed out, both the right and the left, you can find consensus and agreement in regards to protecting that. Why is it even a debate?
It's such a gut level desire people in power have always had in every society across history. They want to be able to control what people can say about them. They want to be able to silence criticism. It's actually, free speech is as fundamental as it is to the American identity and our experience. In some ways, it's very counterintuitive. It is not the knee-jerk response that people have. It takes a lot of learning for a society to realize you have to struggle through listening to all these ideas that you think are wrong or hateful or, some very bad for society. Sometimes people, say that about promotion of political ideologies, that it's how dangerous is it to, go down the road to socialism or fascism. So we have to silence the socialists or the fascists. It takes a lot of experience in a pluralistic, diverse society with a lot of conflict to sort of get to the truce position on free speech, which is that we're going to have to protect it for all as well as for one. And then some people get to a more enlightened appreciation of free speech, which is that people really cannot be free and cannot know the world around them if they are not able to freely explore ideas and other perspectives. But I think at the end of the day, that sort of self-interested defense of free speech matters more to people in the moment. It's easier to get people to respond to that. And so that oftentimes is the starting point for these conversations. You can't expect these rights to protect you when you're out of power if you don't protect them for other people when you're in power.
Very good point. So you and I have been watching how the free speech and debates overlap with campaign finance. Recently, we've seen some frame like media coverage itself and even political satire as a form of political spending. And I don't know if that's a new argument in regards to it. I think it's probably bubbled up out there for many years, if not since the beginning of the Republic. But there's an argument here that the broadcast networks and even some of the late night comedy shows are basically running in-kind contributions for one party or the other. How do you make sense of that intersection between campaign finance law and the First Amendment?
Well, it's a really important topic. I'm glad you brought it up. Campaign finance laws are usually not the first or even the second or third thing that Americans think about when they think about free speech issues. But if you step back for a minute, the ability to control how people can raise and spend money to promote political ideas and campaigns really gets to the core of what the First Amendment is trying to protect, that the government does not get to control speech about the government, who controls the government or what that power is used for. So that's why the First Amendment does not allow, for instance, the government to cap how much money a candidate can spend in their campaign. It's not that we all love seeing a million political ads every time we try to watch a football game or open up YouTube. It's that it's too much power to let the government say to somebody, you've spoken enough, you're not speaking anymore. We just can't let that happen. So campaign finance laws are where a lot of the important fights in the modern world happen for free speech. And almost every U.S. administration flirts with changing or expanding them in some ways. During the Biden administration, the Freedom to Vote Act was always one of the big pieces of legislation that they were pushing for in Congress. That included hundreds of pages of changes to campaign finance rules and how political speech and advocacy is regulated, despite the name of that bill not really giving you any indication that that's what it would be about. During the Obama years, there was the IRS targeting scandal where the IRS went after a lot of Tea Party groups. They also were promoting legislation called the Disclose Act to try to force a lot more nonprofits to have to publish names and addresses of people who were giving them money. And then even George W. Bush, to give a Republican example, he signed the McCain-Feingold campaign finance law into effect. So we certainly shouldn't be surprised anytime we see an administration, including the Trump administration, look at this body of law and say, hey, this might be a useful tool if we wanted to harass our enemies or help our allies. Now, the specific issue you mentioned about in-kind contributions, I don't think that's going anywhere under current law. Those are regulations that exist to prevent people from circumventing the campaign finance rules. So a donor can't say, I want to give this candidate $1 million, but I don't want anybody to know. So I'm just going to donate $1 million in office supplies to his campaign. You can't do that. That would be an in-kind contribution. And you also can't contribute $1 million to a candidate's campaign. The contribution limits are far, far lower than that. So I don't think the administration is going to have a lot of luck stretching the in-kind contribution rationale to say, well, if a TV network's saying bad things about me or good things about my opponent, that's effectively an ad. Freedom of speech and freedom of the press would fall apart pretty quickly if that were the case. And that's why media companies generally are exempt from most campaign finance rules. A negative news article is not an electioneering communication. An editorial is not a campaign ad, even if they share a lot of similarities, frankly, in terms of both being forms of paid speech that can advocate for political action, including, in the context of elections and who you should vote for.
Well, it's interesting too, because as the election campaign finance things, has been extended or tried to be extended to nonprofits and their speech. You also get into, we're not, I guess it may be fair to say we're not technically in an election cycle right now, but it feels like we're always in an election cycle. One of the things too that we talk about citizens' right to petition its government, a person's right to petition its government for redress of grievances. Those types of things, feel like they're kind of coming into play here, and folks are challenging that and viewing it, try to view it in a campaign finance lens, when it may be somebody just exercising their First Amendment right to say they don't like this policy or that, or may want to have some political satire on it. So, what's your kind of perspective on how this plays into the broader discussion of ideas?
Yeah, well, the point you raise about when are we in an election cycle, when aren't we, that's a really live issue in a lot of these regulations. One of the big ways that people will propose to expand the regulation of political speech, which if you just say it like that, meets a lot of opposition and is not very popular. But instead, they'll try to expand the period of time during which we regulate, election ads. Even if those ads don't say anything about the election or about who you should vote for, if they just reference a candidate. And so when you start stretching those periods of time further and further, you swallow up more and more speech that's really not about elections. They might just be running an ad saying, hey, call your senator to vote for this bill. It's going to be coming up next week in the legislature. We got to get it passed. And now campaign finance rules are going to prevent a nonprofit from being able to do that. That's a pretty big free speech issue because, nonprofits have played a role. If you think about it, anyone can form a nonprofit. You can get together with your friends, figure out how to file the paperwork, maybe want to meet with an attorney. But the idea is that anyone can exercise these rights and set up an organization of like-minded people and go out there and speak to fellow citizens. That's free speech. That's democracy. And so we're supposed to have very limited exceptions for where we can regulate that activity when it's large sums of money directly before an election, really targeted on election influence. And the further out we move from that, the more you get to just a wholesale regulation of political speech. And so there's always that risk with campaign finance that it can swallow the whole of the First Amendment if you just start, pulling on every little thread and being as expansive as you can with definitions and timeframes for when you want to do this stuff.
So it's interesting, obviously some of the nexus has been on whether or not dollars are being expended. If you are spending money to make a donation to a political campaign, that's a disclosable event usually, things if it's directly to the campaign. If you are hiring a lobbyist to help you work through the legislative process of either the state or the federal level, it's that dollar expenditure that's there. But with Citizens United, I mean, and some of the disclosures that are in regards to that. I mean, and as what we've seen in targeting and others for, donors and others that are exercising their their First Amendment rights, things practically, does that have a chilling effect on the First Amendment, or do you see it as kind of just par for the course?
These regulations absolutely have a strong chilling effect. I mentioned you might want to consult an attorney before trying to set up an organization. You definitely want to consult an attorney if you're going to be doing activity that could be regulated by these laws. They are not written in a way that's easy for an average citizen to comply with. And that alone is a serious First Amendment problem, given how fundamental these rights are. Citizens United, you mentioned that case that brought up another one of these tricky issues with this area of law, which is what is the line between an ad and just a documentary or a movie or a book? Citizens United made a full-length documentary criticizing Hillary Clinton, and they wanted to air it and advertise it during the 2008 primaries, and the Federal Election Commission told them they couldn't because there was a law in the book saying corporations, including nonprofit corporations, are not allowed to fund these sorts of expenditures that they looked at as, it's a 90-minute campaign ad in effect. And when it got to the Supreme Court, the justices were like, well, does that mean the government can ban full-length movies and books that criticize candidates? I mean, that's never really been how we've done things in this country. Simon and Schuster and Penguin Random House can't, because they're corporations, they can't publish an author who wants to criticize a candidate for office. That seems crazy. And Justice Alito put that question to the government. Do you think the law gives you the power to ban a book if it has one line of political advocacy in it? And the government said yes. They later attempted to walk that back because they knew they were going to lose once that became the focal point of the case. But I think it speaks to how, sometimes people have a gut level sense that if you're spending money to influence political outcomes in any way, shape, or form, that should just be regulated. And if not for the media exemption and some other things that have really limited the reach of our campaign finance laws, like the Citizens United decision, I think it would be obvious that you can't do that and still have anything that we recognize as free speech. You cannot get money out of politics, so to speak, without gutting the First Amendment.
That's very interesting. So you mentioned the media exception, but if campaign finance rules were applied more broadly, say to newspapers and Saturday Night Live, you'd kind of quickly see how unworkable they are, I would imagine.
Yeah, that would just show you that, a world that takes these laws to their logical conclusions is not a world that would be friendly to free speech at all. It'd be very difficult to have news reporting or political satire in that world. Saturday Night Live sketches, of course, they can leave viewers with a pretty clear sense of the show writers' opinions about, the fitness for office of the people that they are making fun of. Not always, but often the case. And this is a point that got made in the aftermath of Citizens United by defenders of the decision that if you're so outraged that a corporation can do this, why are you okay with these other corporations, in many cases much larger corporations, for-profit corporations, engaging in this type of speech? And I think the response to that is not to say, well, let's get rid of Saturday Night Live and press freedom. It's to recognize that, the press is not a special category of companies and people. Press is a thing that we do, and anyone who engages in press activities ought to have those protections under the law. That's generally how the Supreme Court has approached press freedom. So yeah, I think without the media exemption, the contradictions in campaign finance law would be apparent to a lot more people.
And let me ask you, before we move on to things, your opinion of the courts and their consistent free speech.
I think it varies by issue. I think, the Supreme Court, when it comes to political speech rights in the campaign finance context, has been pretty strong. They're not always as active as I'd like them to be. There's all kinds of lower court rulings and state laws that, I would like to see get taken up that are not. But when they do hear cases, they usually come down pretty strongly. We did have a disappointment last year in the Murthy case on the question of jawboning. That was a case about the Biden administration's efforts to pressure social media companies around speech about COVID. That did not end up being useful. And I think a lot of the free speech controversies that we're seeing right now sort of fall into that jawboning category. At some point, the court's going to have to tackle that. And we missed a great opportunity for it in the last term. So definitely a mixed record, but I do think that the Supreme Court, if you're going to be ranking our different political institutions on how reliable they are for sticking up for First Amendment rights, the Supreme Court's going to do a lot better than many others.
And you mentioned jawboning. I want to make sure that our viewers and listeners understand what it is. Can you explain, kind of more of that concept and why it's so important?
Yeah, so the government in the First Amendment context, the things that it is prohibited from doing directly, it is also generally prohibited from doing indirectly. So if the government can't demand that you get fired from your job for a thing that you said, they also can't pressure the company to do that either. So we see a lot of jawboning, like with the Jimmy Kimmel issue with the FCC and ABC. Brendan Carr, went on an interview and said, I believe he used these words, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Things like that, where the government has a tremendous amount of power over a lot of different entities in our society. And so when they sort of hint that if you don't do what we like to sort of control speech the way we like, maybe, down the line we'll do something that's bad for you, that can motivate a lot of action. And if we don't, police that well, then the government can achieve a lot of the censorship outcomes that it wants to achieve without actually doing the dirty work itself, because they just sort of pressure companies and other institutions into doing it for them. So that's called jawboning, and it is not permitted, but it is sort of hard to police. And the Murthy case, was kind of exemplified those issues. The court, for whatever reason, wasn't able to get itself to a place where it was willing to say that the federal government had violated First Amendment rights in the pressure it applied to social media companies.
And I suspect it's hard to police and hard to prove things. And so the court probably hasn't set standards in regards to that. And that may be some of the challenges that we see coming up over the next several years in response to some of the cases that, are the instances that we're talking about today.
Yeah, that's a great point. You need someone who's willing to actually challenge and fight it. And so we're seeing stuff now about things that happened during the Biden years, that companies are only at this moment, now that power has changed hands, willing to come out and say, hey, these were the ways that we felt pressured to censor speech. And you need somebody to stand up in the moment and do that. A lot of what we know about the Biden administration jawboning comes out of the fact that Twitter got purchased by Elon Musk. And then he published a lot of things that very well could have not seen the light of day if ownership had not changed hands. So yeah, the difficulty of proving jawboning, that really is the obstacle in rooting it out.
Yep. So I want to change gears a little bit and talk about hate speech and government labeling. So let's talk about hate speech in particular. It's a phrase that everybody throws around, but in U.S. law, it's not actually a category of speech. I've heard you argue that labeling something hate speech is often a political move that risks sliding into censorship. Now, how do you explain this to the public in regards to that? Because, everybody wants to be against hate speech, but there's consequences to that labeling. There's consequences to that type of approach of things on.
Yeah, I mean, the question is always, who gets to define hate speech? Who gets to enforce those laws? Attorney General Pam Bondi invoked hate speech recently in talking about reactions to the Kirk assassination, suggesting that the Justice Department was looking into these potential cases for prosecution. And that raised red flags all over the free speech community and really all over the political world. I mean, a lot of Republicans called her out for that. And she did sort of try to walk back her comment a little bit by sort of trying to redefine hate speech in terms of things that are already not protected under U.S. law, like true threats, speech directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action. That comes from a 1969 Supreme Court case called Brandenburg v. Ohio. There is speech that's not protected in the U.S. That's been worked out over many, many generations of First Amendment laws, of First Amendment cases. Hate speech, those laws exist in other parts of the world, but they're not a thing in the U.S. And it's such a loose category, so it's very easy to abuse for censorship. The line between criticism of a policy or an official and hate can be really hard to define. If you take something like the Israel-Hamas war, How do you draw that exact line between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitic hate speech? There might be some cases that are tough, and it matters a tremendous amount who's in power then when they're going to be enforcing those things. We also live in a very diverse, pluralistic society where one person's deeply held religious belief is another person's blasphemy. So laws against speech that's deemed hateful or demeaning, that's going to mean vastly different things to different people. And so when you have a law that is vague and broad like that, it just becomes a tool for the people in power to do what they want with it. And, President Trump, I think sometimes it probably does us a favor in being so open about some of his motivations. It very clear when he gets talked about this stuff that, he would like to shut down speech that criticizes him. He thinks that media attacks on him are hateful. And that's what these laws are for. So it's a very short road from saying we should prevent hate speech to letting the government shut down all types of political criticism that it doesn't like under that pretext.
Are there other labels for speech, like the hate speech, that we should be aware of, and how governments are trying to regulate and control?
Well, I think now we're seeing an attempt to stretch the terms that are outside the bounds of First Amendment protection. Like we've seen Stephen Miller say that it's incitement. And incitement is not protected under the First Amendment, but he says it's incitement basically to call the administration authoritarian or fascist. That is not incitement. That is political speech that has always been protected by the First Amendment. So I think Americans are wary enough of new rationales to restrict our free speech rights that you're probably going to see more efforts to leverage the language of existing law to try to, but twisting it in ways that will allow them to get into new areas. So, I think incitement is one of those. There's a difference between speech that we think generally promotes disorder in some sense and what the legal category of incitement is, which goes back to producing imminent lawless action, like I was talking about earlier.
Yeah. And of course, the danger in all this is that the government winds up deciding what ideas are allowed in the public square.
Exactly.
So let's talk a little bit about the historical parallels and maybe lessons from our past things. One of the big questions people ask is whether America's institutions can weather this storm. We've been through waves of speech suppression before, McCarthyism, post 9/11. One of the things that comes to mind is the backlash against the Dixie Chicks. Of course, they're back again, so maybe for time. But what parallels do you see, and do they give us any reason for optimism or maybe greater reason for concern?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the latter part is a matter of perspective. There certainly are a lot of episodes in our history that you can look back on, and I think it is consoling in a way that we've faced moments like this before and much worse moments many times in our history. The first infamous crackdown on free speech, at least from the U.S. federal government, is the Alien and Sedition Acts, and those were passed, I believe, in 1798 under President John Adams, just our second president, only about a decade removed from the ratification of the Constitution. We didn't even make it like 10 years before we had a major crackdown on free speech. The same generation that had ratified the First Amendment. We often talk about the wisdom of the founding fathers, but of course they disagreed a lot and often disagreed with each other if you just sample their opinions a few years apart. And so even that founding generation, they had this problem very, very quickly. I believe the Alien and Sedition Acts attempted to criminalize false or malicious statements about the government. And you can imagine in today's environment, similar proposals being launched that we would have to fight back on free speech grounds. That went away when the Federalist Party lost power and Jefferson's Democratic Republicans came to the fore. And really, the Alien Sedition Acts were a big part of that. I think censors overreacting and people having a backlash to that is a major trend here. And so that's something, the administration's going to want to be mindful of. You don't want to give your opponents the seeds for the next successful campaign against them by becoming the party of censorship. So, some other ones we can talk about, the Sedition Act during World War I under Woodrow Wilson, banned the use of disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the U.S. government. I wrote that one down. And Eugene Debs, who had been the socialist candidate for president, he was imprisoned during this time period. I mean, you think about what that would look like today. I mean, there have been attempts to imprison people who have run for president. And it would be something to see it actually happen. That law got repealed after the war. McCarthyism, mid 20th century, that's a great example because that was a lot of jawboning, which is what we see so much of today. There wasn't as much censorship done by the government directly at that time as through private entities who knew better than to wind up on the government's bads. So I think there's a parallel there. And McCarthyism is another example where censors, they just can't help themselves. They always go too far and provoke a backlash. And, the post 9/11 environment, I think is another one of those times. Sometimes a mood sweeps the country, but it doesn't last. I think that's a lesson we could all learn today is whatever the trend is now, it won't be the trend forever. Whoever's in power today won't be in power forever. You have to be mindful of that, not to overreact when you are in power and to not lose the faith when you're out of power. And if you're someone who doesn't really feel represented when either side's in power, then you just hold out hope that the competition between them and that cycle will produce some free speech norms that we all get to benefit from. But I think the key takeaway from all of that is it oftentimes is the reaction and backlash to censorship that starts to weaken the grip on institutions that the censors have.
So as you went through that timeline of issues and response and everything, it kind of occurs to me, and I'm interested in your perspective on it. Are the efforts for censorship and restrictions on free speech, are they populist tendencies?
I think they can be, but I think they come from all directions. You can also get very elitist ones where people are very concerned about what the people are saying. I think a lot of concerns about like misinformation, which was one of the things that the Biden administration worked a lot. Those are elitist concerns, but then there are populist ones as well. Things like we should ban flag burning, hate speech laws. A lot of times these are, bottom up things, although people in power will grab onto them too. I definitely think, populist movements, they often present risks for free speech and for civil liberties in general. But they can also be reactions to crackdowns on those freedoms by other administrations. So I'm hesitant to overcharacterize one way or the other.
Yeah.
I think it's more about power than who holds it.
Yes, good point. So I want to zoom in on some different arenas, and I'm going to toss them out one by one, and you kind of share what you're seeing. Maybe we can chat a little bit about them, things, but all of them are kind of free speech forums and things. But universities, rising intolerance for differing views, and what is an area that has traditionally been considered a very free speech area, free exchange of ideas, but that's also now sometimes crossing into violence things. What are you seeing on university campuses around the country?
Yeah, university campuses have been a problem for a long time. Like you said, these should be centers of free speech. This should be where the open exchange of ideas and diversity of opinion is held the highest. And that's often not been the case. Charlie Kirk was doing a lot of work to try to change that culture on campuses and get students to engage in free speech. There was a recent survey by FIRE, the free speech group, that showed a new high for the number of college students that are accepting of political violence in certain circumstances. That's very bad. We need our young people, and especially the best and brightest of our young people, to be committed to free speech and tolerance and open debate. And I think on college campuses, it's a big cultural problem. We are not doing enough to teach those things, and too many students come out of that experience cynical about our institutions as opposed to feeling empowered and engaged.
Do you think that tolerance for the rise in political violence things, what do we attribute that to? Is it the lack of free speech, the lack of being confronted with it, the lack of having to work through different ideas? Why is that on the rise?
I only have speculation for that. I think first of all, I think a lot of people who answer that way in a poll would never commit political violence themselves, but they might feel a vicarious thrill for it or support it being done by someone somewhere. And I think sometimes that arises from a feeling of powerlessness, of being helpless, but I don't know for sure. And I think that psychologically is something that we have accidentally maybe or without realizing it. I think we do sort of teach that to our young people when it comes to politics. I do think we sort of give them a cynical, disempowered version of what American democracy is and can be. So I wonder about that, if it's people feeling so alienated from their communities and their institutions that they're just losing sight of that common humanity that we all have. But again, that is just sort of me trying to work through all the different things that we're seeing out there. And I think everyone's, trying to figure out how did this happen and how did we get here?
And how do we get out of it?
Yeah.
Things. So, and the next topic, I don't know if we get out of it or further into it, but media and social media, censorship, government pressuring, jawboning, as you'd mentioned, or kind of regardless of administration. Obviously, traditional media being on the decline, things challenged by social media. Social being the wild west of the exchange of ideas on a level like we've not seen before. What are you seeing relative to free speech in those forums?
It's not good. I mean, I think the fact that there was so much jawboning in the previous administration and they, in a lot of ways, kind of got away with it is going to incentivize the current administration to engage in similar practices and even step it up a notch. And I think that we've seen that. And so how are we going to get back to a sort of détente on this issue where both sides leave well enough alone? I don't know. And I think, that's why it's so disappointing that the Supreme Court didn't have a stronger ruling in the Murthy case last year. And eventually someone's going to have a pretty thick backbone and take the risk and fight one of these cases when the government comes to them and tells them to censor. Instead of doing it, they're going to have to say, publish it, scream to the world that this is what's happening and go to court and fight it out. And we got to get the right case with the right fact pattern in front of the Supreme Court so that we can change the game on this issue. I think that's, where the legal fight needs to be had, and then figuring out the political conversation about how do you get sides to stop escalating the battle and start respecting free speech a little bit more. That's a tougher one.
Do you think that case is out there somewhere right now? Has it been filed? Is it waiting to be filed? Do you see anything that has the possibility of being that case at the Supreme Court?
I don't know. I don't know if that case is already out there. It wouldn't surprise me if it's not. Like you said, it's so difficult to prove this stuff, and most people, just don't want the hassle. And I say people. I mean, these are usually large institutions that have a lot of economic incentive and maybe shareholders, and it's not always easy for them to take a principled fight that they could potentially lose, but someone's going to have to do that. And whenever that happens, the entire First Amendment movement needs to be at their sails.
Next topic, arena, is nonprofits, which I know is near and dear to the foundation's mission related to donor privacy and advocacy rights. Talk to us about what you guys are seeing with threats to nonprofits and donors, and then, any glimmers of hope out there.
Yeah, this is the aspect of this problem that we have worked on the longest, studied the hardest, and have the most ready-made game plan for how to address it. And that's because this did not arise overnight or over the last couple of years. We were founded back in 2018 because we were already seeing this trend, not always with violence and assassinations, but with the things that come before that. The cancel culture efforts trying to get people fired, the inundating of people with violent, harassing threats, suggesting that they will come get them, even if they don't ultimately do that, and efforts to try to expose donors, members, volunteers of groups, and just sort of get everybody on a side and have combat instead of conversation. We saw that trend coming a long time ago. Politicians on both sides using the term dark money to describe any group that wasn't giving you a list of its members' home addresses and employers. And we thought that's crazy. This stuff is fundamental democratic engagement, fundamental First Amendment rights. And so we started working to defend the rights of all Americans, no matter your beliefs, no matter which side you're on, who you want to support. You should be able to join, to volunteer for, to donate to nonprofit organizations that share your beliefs without having your information exposed to people who might do you harm. And there's unfortunately, been an escalation on the rhetoric on that in the wake of the Kirk assassination. Vice President J.D. Vance was on Kirk's podcast and was railing against this article that had ran in The Nation, left-wing magazine, that was, harshly critical of Kirk in the aftermath of his assassination. And Vance wanted to go after the donors that fund the nation, which in many cases are these nonprofit foundations on the left. He's previously described some of those foundations, like the Ford Foundation or George Soros's group, as cancers on American society. Trump as well takes plenty of shots at George Soros and other liberal donors, suggesting they're funding disorder. And, look, I think that attempting to tie Kirk's killer to this stuff, that shows you how strong the desire is to go after these groups, because that's a very big stretch. There's really nothing to indicate that this guy got radicalized because he was, reading policy papers from the Center for American Progress or something. I mean, I don't think anyone even seriously believes that. It's just a sense that, leftist donors and institutions are the ones that kind of fund groups that get involved in the sorts of protest activity that occasionally, turns a little violent, that, it's really sort of ginned up based on very little, very little factual evidence, at least that we've seen so far. So we're still waiting to see what form that particular, attack on nonprofits might take. There's not like a bill that's been introduced in Congress or an effort that's already underway at the IRS that we've seen, but it's clear that they want to make liberal donors and institutions into the villains here and try to use this to tear them down. And that's very concerning. And it goes back to what we've been talking about, that these rights matter for both sides. The political right has a lot at stake with their nonprofits and their donors as well. And when liberals are in power in a lot of institutions, the nonprofit sector becomes very important for pro-life voice, anti-tax voices, anti-immigration voices, gun rights voices, all sorts of causes associated with the political right in America today. Have relied tremendously on large donors and nonprofit organizations to promote their ideas when they are out of power. So that's a very concerning road to go down. Now, fortunately, at People United for Privacy Foundation, we've been working for years and we've made a lot of progress. So we've gotten 22 to pass a law that makes it clear that state officials can't just demand or disclose a nonprofit's the personal information of their members, donors, and volunteers. We've helped a bunch of states go clean up their old laws, that maybe they have some outdated statutes that don't work for the internet age, or maybe they have some unconstitutional statutes that just never got removed. And so we've helped them, make sure there aren't unnecessary privacy leaks in their laws. We've also been advocating on the federal level to start redacting these names and numbers of donors from public reports. You just don't need that level of detail to satisfy transparency obligations, and it puts people at risk for engaging and participating in politics, which is everybody's fundamental rights. So, we expect nonprofits to continue to be a battlefield. I don't know when this will air, so maybe there will already have been some developments between our conversation and when this comes out, and we will be following all of that very, very closely. But this is an area, donor privacy and protecting the rights of nonprofit advocacy groups. This is one where we at least know what the solutions are, and we've been working for years to convince those in power that this is the important thing to do. So we're a little bit more ready for this fight than maybe for some others. And certainly as it develops, People United for Privacy Foundation will be at the center of it.
Well, it leads me to like one of my favorite phrases that's associated with the foundation is that transparency is for government, privacy is for people. And, and that kind of sums it up a lot. But why is that distinction so important? And how do you make the case that donor and member privacy is about free speech just as much as rallies and protests are?
Well, I always start by pointing out this is not a new idea. It's actually a very old idea. Our founding fathers wrote under pen names. They founded secret societies. They understood all about how if you don't protect the identities of the people who are organizing to change the government, the people who are in power might come after those people, and that can undermine and silence free speech. So things like Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, anonymously authored and published, the Federalist Papers, which advocated for the ratification of the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay. We know they were the authors, but at the time, They all wrote under the pen name Publius. You can fast forward to, like we were talking about, or I actually don't know if we did get into it, but the civil rights movement, Jim Crow states, when they were trying to figure out how do we shut down the NAACP, how do we get them to stop registering voters and filing lawsuits and doing all this protest activity, they went after their donor list. They tried to say, you have to give us the list of your members and donors. Where is your money coming from? That did go to the Supreme Court in 1958, unanimously ruled to protect the NAACP's member list. So this was not, new or controversial or one side's conception of free speech. This is a long-standing bit of historical wisdom that privacy in association is often indispensable to free speech. So that phrase, transparency is for government, privacy is for people, is about setting that line where it belongs. The aftermath of Watergate, we got all of these new laws around money in politics trying to address the corruption that happened in the Nixon administration. But again, politicians and regulators, they can't help themselves. Slowly but surely, those laws get stretched and pulled and new ones get added. And you end up with this big thicket of laws that nonprofits can get tripped up in when they want to speak about political issues to their members or to the public. So these laws that were meant to bring transparency to what's happening in the government in Richard Nixon's reelection campaign end up being a burden on the privacy rights of average Americans, small volunteer-run groups, just trying to speak independently about what they believe in. So that is a long explanation for a phrase that really doesn't need it, because people get it when you say it. People have a right to privacy, and when the government starts arguing that you need to be transparent about what groups you're joining and who you're talking to about what, that is not transparency, that is surveillance. And there's a big difference between that. So it's just all about getting people to remember transparency laws are supposed to let us monitor what's going on in our government. They're not supposed to let our government monitor what's going on with us.
Very good point. So looking ahead, Free Speech Week is coming up in October, and America's 250th anniversary is just around the corner. If you could deliver one message to policymakers and citizens about the future of free speech, what would it be?
Nobody gets to be in power forever, so plan for your enemies to be in power one day. No matter who you are or who they are, we need to craft laws and set precedents that will protect us no matter who's in the Oval Office or who's in Congress or who's on the Supreme Court. And I think with America 250, we should remember free speech is a big part of what made our country great. It is not easy. People get to say things that are false, that are wrong, that are stupid, that are damaging, that are hateful. But it is worth enduring, because there is no other way to avoid becoming like the many, many other countries on this planet where you can go to jail for something that you tweeted, or, you don't have the right to get together with your friends and neighbors and form a group and start spending money saying, hey, we think this needs to change in the government. Where, countries where the media is not free, where the government controls what sorts of things you get to hear. The only way to avoid going down those paths to tyranny and preserving what makes America great is to protect free speech, even when it's difficult, even when it pains us, even when it's the free speech rights of those that we hate or those who hate us. Free speech is the right that protects all of the rights. And I will add, for People United for Privacy Foundation, donor privacy is the right that protects free speech.
Sound advice. Thank you, Luke, for your insights and perspective and for visiting with us today. We'll share links to the People United for Privacy Foundation and your work in the comment section following this episode. And for our listeners and viewers, if you enjoyed this episode, follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, or wherever you get your podcast. Free speech has always been contested, but as today's conversation reminds us, it remains a bedrock of American democracy. We appreciate you joining and hope that you'll tune back in. Thank you all very much.
Thanks for joining this edition of GovExperts Insights. We invite you to follow this and other episodes at govexperts.com or on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and our other social media channels.